remind me to record. I noticed on homework number 4 that there was a typo. Question number 7, if you look at it, it says, wait, question number 7, question number 6. Let me show this to you. Question number 6. The version I sent you, it says consider a positive aggregate demand shock of A bar equals negative 2%. It should be a negative demand shock of A bar equals negative 2%, right? So don't be confused by the positive there. It should read negative, right? All right, anybody have any other questions about homework number 4? Have you had a chance to take a look at it? Okay, well, if you do this afternoon, we can definitely have some time to talk about that. So, you try to spend maybe a little bit of time looking over the homework so that you can ask questions about it. Remember, it's due tomorrow morning before class, right? Tomorrow morning before class. Okay, well, what are we talking about today? Today, we're going to talk about financial crises, right? So in our short-run macro model, we have, we've kind of developed this model that talks about business cycles. We've talked about demand shocks. We've talked about supply shocks. We've talked about how dynamics can cause these shocks to last multiple periods. But the one thing we haven't really incorporated into our short-run macro model is any sort of finance or financial systems or financial crises or financial shocks. And so what we want to do here in chapter 10 and chapter 14 is really kind of incorporate that into our model, in part because we know that this is important based on recent history, right? Primarily the global financial crisis of 2008. And so, while we want to talk about how financial crises fit into our short-run macro model, we also want to talk about the crisis of 2008, right? Because that's important. It's important not only to kind of understand modern business cycles, but I think it actually gives us some good insight into what we're talking about today going on with COVID, right? I mean, whenever there's a crisis, economists learn a lot from crises, right? To some extent, economic crises are kind of like when your car breaks down. It's a good excuse to kind of pop up the hood and, begin to fiddle with it. And sometimes you learn more by working with broken machinery than machinery that's working perfectly. And so that is definitely the case when it comes to recessions, right? They're big learning experiences for economists. And so economists learned a lot during 2008, though there's a lot that we're still trying to figure out. And a lot of that is coming into play now as we try to deal with this COVID crisis. In fact, if any of you have looked at the macro paper that I've assigned you for your writing assignment, this is really where the macro paper, the article that I assigned you from The Economist begins, right? The article from The Economist says, if you want to understand the implications of the COVID crisis, we have to really start back in 2008 and thinking about the global financial crisis and then its aftermath, right? And then where that leads us today as this COVID crisis is going forward. So anyway, so what we talk about today, I think, is important, not just in terms of understanding business cycles, but it'll also be important for you on exam number 2, but also writing that macro paper, right? Where a lot of this is going to be kind of the background information to thinking about what's happening today in the economy. All right, so let's talk about financial crises. And let's begin here by just doing a little recap. I'm just going to show you my notes here. Just a little recap of the global financial crisis that lasted between 2007 and 2009, but which in reality has had much longer lasting effects that have extended past 2009. You have to think about the global financial crisis as having 3 big components, okay? 3 big components. The first, the one we're probably the most familiar with, is the housing bubble and the subsequent crash, okay? So here's figure 10.1 from your book, and you can see that housing prices declined by about 35% from peak to trough, from top to bottom, This was after a decade of growth in which housing prices in most metropolitan areas in the US were growing at 10% or more a year. Okay, so you see that huge buildup beginning basically in the mid 1990s that lasted until 2007. So this huge buildup, then followed by this dramatic drop, right? Kind of a classic bubble behavior. And so this was a dramatic shock to the US economy, right? The biggest reason why this is a dramatic shock is because many households have a very large proportion of their wealth tied up in their house, right? So on average, the average household has about 40% of their wealth in their house, okay? And so if you actually look at what happened to household wealth here in figure 16.5, this is looking at net worth of households divided by their disposable income. And you can see this dramatic drop in household wealth that occurred in 2007 to 2009, right? This is a fall of about 20% in household wealth, right? And at times, right, for some people, depending upon where you lived, it was not uncommon to see your wealth fall by 50% or more in some urban metropolitan areas. So this was a dramatic decline in wealth for many people, right? So that's the first part of the global financial crisis. The second part was the global savings glut. Huge increases in savings globally. And a lot of this was savings that ended up in the United States financial system, leading to much lower interest rates in the US, but also fueling the borrowing boom that led to the housing bubble. So most people don't buy houses with cash, they borrow the money. And so the question is, where would you borrow? Well, in the late 1990s, it became easy to borrow, in part because the US financial system was just awash with cash, right? Particularly cash from other countries, China in particular, right? So the late 1990s was a kind of boom era in the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is growing very fast. Typical Chinese citizens have very high savings rates. They save between 40 and 50% of their income. And so as middle-class Chinese people began to save more and more, a lot of them didn't want to save in China. They wanted to try to get their money out. And once they got their money out, they wanted to find a safe place to save. And that was oftentimes the US financial system. And so this huge increase in supply and savings contributed to much lower interest rates and a borrowing boom in the US. We talked yesterday, right? Actually, this was in your homework number 3, about the decline in the ex-ante real interest rate. And if you go back and look at that graph, you'll see that that really began in the 1990s. Ex-ante real interest rates were negative. That's a huge incentive to borrow, right? That's a huge incentive to borrow. And so, a lot of people were looking at mortgage interest rates and like, why shouldn't I borrow money? It's essentially free, right? It's essentially free. And so there was a huge borrowing boom in the US. And, a lot of this borrowing is because, if you look at US savings rates, they're actually pretty low relative to the rest of the world. So Americans don't like to save. We tend to like to spend. Other countries were happy to lend us money at very low interest rates. And so we just started accumulating debt. And a lot of this debt was mortgage debt, right? Directly tied to housing prices. So this is figure 16.3 here. You can see the vast kind of accumulation of household debt that took place in the US in the 1990s and 2000s leading up to the global financial crisis. And then, of course, the aftermath, right, where debt has declined quite a bit. In fact, that's one of the reasons why this COVID crisis is not worse, is because actually household debt was relatively low before the COVID crisis, right? Which is one of the reasons why we haven't seen kind of the catastrophe that we saw in 2008, where people were much more highly leveraged with lots of debt. The third big development here, or the third leg of the table that was the global financial crisis was financial development. That there's this huge demand to borrow money, there's this huge supply of money, but then the US financial system developed all sorts of new tools by which people could borrow money in different ways. The most important of these was securitization and the subprime mortgage boom. I'm going to assume that most of you are somewhat familiar with securitization, given that this is something that, we talk about in principles a lot. If you've taken money in banking or finance classes, I know you've talked about securitization, so I'm not going to talk about this in any great detail. But securitization is essentially the process of taking illiquid assets and transferring them into liquid assets. And where this happened in mortgages was through mortgage-backed securities, okay? So mortgages are traditionally assets that are illiquid, right? They're very difficult to trade, in part because every mortgage is unique, right? It has a different value amount, a different interest rate. Every borrower is unique. The houses that mortgages are tied to are throughout the country, and nobody knows anything about, Mount Vernon, Iowa, or small towns in Illinois. And so each one of these mortgages is unique enough not to be really that attractive to investors. But the idea was that if you could issue bonds, take the money from these bonds and buy a whole bunch of mortgages, you could pool them together. And that this pool of mortgage, because of the law of large numbers, basically would become more predictable. And so you could pool mortgages together by buying them, and then take the proceeds that people, when people make their mortgage payments, and use those mortgage payments to then pay the interest on the bonds, right? And so what you've essentially done here is you've transferred mortgages into bonds. Mortgages which are idiosyncratic and illiquid because they're unique, turned into bonds, which are standardized and attractive to institutional investors. And so these things, mortgage-backed securities, took off like a rocket, right? Because these were attractive to investors. They look like bonds, but they're backed by houses. And everybody knows the old phrase, safe as houses, right? And so that's what a lot of investors basically thought, was that, yeah, this is the best of both worlds. It's as safe as a house, but it looks like a bond. I love it. The demand for these were so high that, in essence, banks couldn't issue mortgages fast enough, right? There was such a demand for these mortgage-backed securities. You needed to have mortgages to have more mortgage-backed securities. And so pretty soon banks were giving mortgages to anybody. And so that's the subprime mortgage boom. Subprime is really just a fancy word for people who wouldn't ordinarily qualify for a mortgage. But banks began lending money to these people basically under the assumption that, A, these pools of mortgages were diversified. So even if a small number of them fail, who cares? They're diversified. The other reason why these subprime loans were made was this idea that housing prices, as we saw in the previous graph, would continue to go up by 10% a year. And so if housing prices went up 10% a year, even if somebody did default on their mortgage, you would still have the house, and the house would be very valuable. And so you're safe, you're protected, right? There's very little downside and a lot of upside. At least that's what banks thought. Of course, we all know what happened when housing prices collapsed, is that a lot of people now no longer saw the need to pay their mortgage, even if they could, because the value of their house was well below the value that they borrowed on their mortgage. And banks no longer had as valuable capital as they thought, because the bank might have thought, well, this house will just keep on going up in price. But when the house dropped by 35%, the bank realized that they were going to lose their shirt if they tried to sell the house. If they could sell the house, because the whole housing market in the US basically came to a standstill, where many banks were holding houses that they couldn't sell. So it led to huge losses for banks. And one of the things we know about banks is that they're not designed to take big losses. And so the collapse of the subprime mortgage market basically led to a huge increase in underwater mortgages and default. And what I mean by underwater mortgages is the value of the mortgage was worth more than the value of the house. And so these defaults led to a financial crisis, right? They basically led to a financial crisis. What triggered this? Well, the trigger was basically in 2007 when interest rates started to rise. The rise in interest rates in 2006 and 2007 increased defaults. The defaults then led to a small number of banks getting in trouble. When banks began to get in trouble, interest rates rose even more, and you get this vicious cycle, which is very common in economics, and particularly during financial crises, where defaults lead to panic, lead to decline in asset prices, which lead to more defaults, which lead to more panic, which lead to more decline in asset prices, and you get this vicious circle. Okay? So, as I said, really the crisis began back in August of 2007 when we had the spike in interest rates. All of a sudden, people got very nervous, and there was this flight to safety, right? Everybody wants to sell everything and get into the most safe assets possible. When everybody is trying to sell and nobody is buying, then you have a liquidity crisis. And a liquidity crisis means basically markets break down. Things can't be sold because you can't have a market work in which everybody wants to sell and nobody wants to buy. And that's essentially the situation that we found ourselves in by late 2007, early 2008, right? Is that many financial markets essentially fell apart. Even the safest financial markets. In figure 10.3 here, we have what we'll call, in money and banking, we call the risk premium. The risk premium is basically the difference between an interest rate and a safe interest rate. So the safest interest rate out there is probably the 3-month T-bill, right? This is the short-term bond that the US government borrows money with. So the US government has very little chance of default, so it's probably about as safe as you can have. And the 3-month LIBOR rate, what's LIBOR? LIBOR is an acronym for London Interbank. I don't know what O is. Now that I say that, I don't know what O is, but it's basically the interbank lending rate in London, right? So for globalized banks, for international banks, how much do international banks have to pay to borrow money for 3 months? And so the difference between what banks have to pay to borrow money for 3 months and how much the US government has to pay to borrow money for 3 months. We might think about this as the risk premium, right? Basically, this is a measure of how risky it is to lend money to banks. And look what happened to this risk premium here during the global financial crisis. It went from what is ordinarily 0.25% or 0.5% to 3.5% in a very short period of time, right? So interest rates just spiked up. And this just reflects the fact that nobody could borrow, right? There was an absolute credit crunch. Nobody could borrow because nobody was lending. And nobody was lending because everybody was scared. Stocks took a terrible crash too, right? Stocks from the peak to the bottom fell by about 50% in the United States. And this was also a pretty big hit to wealth, right? So Americans really got hit coming and going. Many Americans lost a lot of wealth as the housing market, as the value of their houses plummeted. And many Americans, lost wealth as the value of their stock portfolio fell. I think one common question that often comes up is, why would the fall in the value of your house, why do people even care to some extent, right? And I say this in that, let's say that you've been living in a house and you have no plans on selling your house. So why would a collapse in the housing market really bug you? You're not going to sell your house anyway. The fact of the matter is it's psychological, right? It's psychological. People feel poor, even if they aren't actually poor, right? Even if they don't actually have to sell their house and experience a loss. or even if they have money in the stock market and are not going to pull their money out, they're saving for retirement. The fact of the matter is, when you see the stock market crash, when you see housing prices crash, even if you're not cashing out of these markets, you feel poor. There is a psychological impact to this. And, that definitely happened in 2008. I just say for myself, maybe you've had this same thought here during the COVID crisis, but I remember when, the stock market was dropping in March and all this kind of stuff, I definitely changed my spending patterns, right? There's probably very little chance I'm going to lose my job. At least I hope, right? I hope Cornell doesn't go under. So there probably was very little chance I was going to lose my job, and there was no chance I was going to get out of the stock market because I basically saved for retirement, and I'm not going to be retiring for a while, hopefully. And so there, as a practical matter, the decline in the markets shouldn't have impacted me, but it does, right? Even as a rational economist, it impacts us. And so, this decline in wealth, whether it was real or perceived, had a big impact in reducing consumption and other ways that we'll talk about here as we move towards talking about our short run macro model. What happened to employment? You can see employment dropped pretty precipitously. About 12 million. I have here about 6 million people lost their jobs, not 12 million. Sorry about that. About 6 million people lost their jobs because of the crisis. You can see the unemployment rate spike. It went up from about 4% to a little bit over 10%. This, of course, fuels the fear, right? Fuels the fear that even people who don't lose their jobs worry about losing their jobs. And then short run output, right? So short run output measured against trend, right? Deviations from trend, we can see that short run output fell by about 6%, which would make it the biggest recession in the US since the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, short run output fell by between 20 and 25%, to give you some rough idea. So the Great Depression is still the Great Depression, but this was a very, very bad recession. Okay. And just to give some idea of this, here's table 10.1 looking at what happens during an average recession and what happened during the Great Recession of 2008. And across all of these categories, whether you're talking about consumption, investment, government purchases, unemployment, GDP, right, we saw much bigger changes during this global financial crisis than we had seen before. Okay. So that's kind of a very brief summary of what happened during the 2008 financial crisis. In a few minutes, we're going to come back and talk about the 2008 financial crisis a little bit more when we talk about stabilization policy, right? When we talk about stabilization policy. But we'll come back to that in a few minutes. The next question for us is, why are financial crises so costly? So this is from a book Reinhart and Rogoff wrote, looking at the history of financial crises in the United States. And one of the things that we see is that financial crises, while relatively rare, are very, very costly. And in many ways, what happened in 2008 was kind of a typical financial crisis, much like we had during the Great Depression, much like we had in 1911, much like we had in 1873, right? These things kind of have periodically happened. We typically see housing prices fall by 35%, equity fall by more than 56%, unemployment rise by 7%, unemployment staying above average for almost 5 years, real GDP falling by 10%, right, and not returning the trend for almost 2 years, government debt going up by almost 86%. So yeah, these things tend to be very costly. In many ways, what happened in 2008 was fairly typical, right? Fairly typical of a financial crisis. We also know the financial crises tend to be fairly international. One of the interesting things is this was not just an international crisis in the US, this really hit across the board, right? This really hit across the board. That almost all countries in the world experienced some kind of financial slowdown or some sort of economic slowdown as a result of the global financial crisis. Either in part because when the US economy slows down, because the US is a big importer, it has a negative impact on other economies. And then sometimes because there were financial ties between the US and other countries, right? So, particularly if you look at that Euro area, a lot of the slowdown in Europe and in the UK was directly related to financial ties between the UK and Europe and the US, right? So when subprime market blew up and stock prices collapsed in the US, that led to a lot of losses in Europe. And so that had kind of similarly negative impacts on the US economy, or not just the US economy, but other countries' economies. So let's see if we can understand this. Why exactly are financial crises so costly, right? I'm going to switch to my iPad screen here. Can you guys see this? This is that same damn problem I was having the other day. Oh, maybe if I plugged it in. Do you think that would help? Let's see. Hey, voila. I am a text expert. All right. So, why are financial crises so costly? Well, there's two facts that I think we have to fundamentally understand about financial crises. First off, it only takes small declines in asset prices to lead to huge declines in finance. Let me say this a different way. Small declines in asset prices. I've really messed this up. Sorry, usually I can talk and write at the same time, but maybe not this morning, okay? It only takes small declines in asset prices to lead to defaults and huge declines in finance. Why is that? Well, it really is the nature of how banks work, right? Banks and other financial intermediaries, meaning institutions that lend money, are highly leveraged and they're highly risky, okay? So let's just think about, just for a minute here, how banks work. Those of you who've taken money in banking, I know there's a number of you who've taken money in banking. This is just a short aside that will be a review for you. But let's think about a bank balance sheet. Okay, so banks have assets and they have liabilities. And how do banks usually operate? Well, they raise money through liabilities, through things like deposits. And I'm just going to put some numbers in here. And they issue bonds, short-term debt. We'll call that short-term debt. And then they also issue some longer-term bonds, call that long-term debt. And then they have equity, meaning ownership shares, right? Whether it's stock or other forms of ownership. And so, obviously a typical bank is a little bit more complicated than this, but in general, this is how banks raise money: through deposits, through issuing debt, and then very importantly, through equity, right? By issuing shares of ownership. What do banks then do with this money? Well, they hold cash and other reserves. Some of these are required reserves, right? Amounts that banks have to hold at the Fed, depending upon what their amount of deposits are. Banks make loans, and this is obviously where most of their revenue comes from. Most of their profit comes from making these loans, which are profitable. Banks also tend to hold a lot of treasury bills and treasury bonds. Sorry, better make that 900. So this adds up to 2,000. And there's some other assets that banks have, right? But we don't have to get into the particulars of this. We'll just look at the big picture, right? These are the kind of main forms of assets that banks have. Now, associated with this bank is the very important financial concept of leverage. And leverage is just the total assets divided by equity. Leverage is a measure of risk. I know we have a lot of finance majors in this class, so you should be familiar with the concept of leverage, right? That higher leverage increases your return on equity. It makes you more profitable, because essentially higher leverage means you can get more assets for any amount of money that owners put into the firm, into the bank. So a higher leverage makes you more profitable. You have more assets on which to make profits with, but it also makes you more risky. And so this is a risk return trade-off, right? The classic risk versus return trade-off in finance. That if a bank has more leverage, it's going to be more risky because it's going to have much more assets relative to a relatively low amount of equity. But it's also going to have higher returns because it's going to have more assets to earn revenue with. Okay, so in this example, what do we have? Well, we have 2,000 in assets, 200 in equity. The leverage here is 10, right? The leverage here is 10 for this bank. Why is leverage a measure of risk, right? Why is leverage a measure of risk? Well, the easiest way to understand this is think about an example. Let's say that a bank suffers a default on its loans of $100. What's going to happen to leverage then? Well, let's go back to our balance sheet. They lose $100 of loans, so that becomes 800, and their assets become 1,900. What happens on the right-hand side? What happens on the liability side? Those losses come from net worth or equity. All of those losses come right out of the net worth or equity of the bank. So now what's the leverage? Total assets divided by equity. What are total assets now? 1,900. What's equity? 100. Look what's happened to leverage. It's almost doubled. A relatively small loss small decline in assets leads to a relatively huge decline in equity, because equity is going to be much smaller than assets. So the percentage change is going to be much bigger. In fact, if we go back up to that balance sheet, what happens if this bank experiences another $100 loss? It's insolvent, right? It's insolvent. If you get to zero equity or below, you can't, the business is default, right? The business is default. For banks, it's even worse because banks have to maintain a certain amount of equity to be able to stay in business, right? Banks face equity requirements, or what are often called capital requirements. This bank is already probably in danger of being closed down by the government because they don't have enough equity to stay in business, right? They're not maintaining the equity that they're required to maintain to stay in business. And so that's the measure of risk, right? The more leverage you have, it really means that a small loss in assets can lead to a huge decline in your equity. And it can, basically force insolvency. And insolvency is when you have equity that is less than zero. For a bank, it's a little bit more complicated than this. You could actually be technically insolvent with positive equity if you're not meeting your equity requirements. And so this is what I mean by banks. Banks are risky, right? Banks are risky. So what are banks forced to do? In the event of losses, banks inevitably try to lower their leverage by selling assets and not lending. This is a credit crunch, right? This is a credit crunch, and this is panic selling. In other words, it becomes very difficult to borrow money. It becomes very difficult to sell, right? So you see this huge decline in finance. You see this huge decline in liquidity because nobody can sell anything anymore because everybody is selling, right? When everybody sells, nobody can sell because nobody's buying. And so you can very much get these negative feedback loops, these vicious cycles. Panic leads to more selling, which leads to a decline in asset prices, which leads to more panic, more selling, declines in asset prices, which leads to more panic, more selling, right? On and on and on and on. That's not even it for the banks, for financial institutions, because there's a second fact here. There's also the problem of bank runs. Banks are not just highly leveraged. They are illiquid. By that, I mean, we all know that when you deposit your money in a bank, the bank just doesn't throw it back there in a vault in a big heap so that the executives can swim around in it and have money fights and, you know, do all the fun things that I would do if I had a bunch of cash. They actually have to lend that money out. There's not enough money in the bank to pay back all depositors. That's how a bank works. So if I can swing back here, if you look at this bank has $1,000 of deposits, but only $100 in reserves. What happens if everybody tries to pull their deposits out at once? There's not enough money for it, right? There's just not enough money for it. It's not going to work. So banks are not just leveraged, meaning they're risky for that reason, but they're also illiquid. And so this is the problem with a self-fulfilling crisis, right? As I said, bank runs can be self-fulfilling. What if people start to think there's going to be a bank run? There is a bank run. Because what if people think there's going to be a bank run? They start pulling their money out. And once you start pulling your money out, what begins to happen to the bank? They become more illiquid and more likely to fail, right? So if everybody thinks a bank is going to fail, they are likely to fail, right? It's what economists call herding, right? That if everybody does something at once, you're going to get these, right, horrible effects. And sometimes it only takes one or two people to do it to essentially spook the herd. And we often see that when it comes to banking crises, right? So both of these facts, the facts that banks are leveraged, coupled with the fact that banks are highly illiquid, make them very vulnerable to crashes, right? To financial crashes. And so what happens during a financial crisis or during a bank crisis? You get large decline in bank prices, you get, large declines in asset prices, you get big declines in lending, and as a result, you get big declines in investment, consumption, and it's these kind of things that fuel a recession, right? Okay, so that's really some of the background information that I wanted to share with you about financial crises and 2008. So the next question is, how do we incorporate this stuff in our short-run macro model, right? How exactly does this fit into the model that we've been developing here over the last week or so? So this seems like a good time to take a break. Let's take a 5-minute break. Let's maybe meet back here at 9:55. And then we're going to talk about how this fits into our macro model. All right. So I'll see you in 5 minutes or so. 9:55. All right, folks. It feels like this is a good day to do which would you choose? All right, so we're going to do a which would you choose here, um, just to give us some Tuesday morning energy, which may or may not be lacking. So let's spend just a couple of minutes doing this. I am picking a card, and the card says, which would you choose? The only food you're allowed to eat will be picked by a 3-year-old, or the only films and TV shows you are allowed to watch will be picked by a very strict nun. All right, so would you rather eat food picked by a 3-year-old? For some of you, that may not be very hard, quite honestly. Or would you only watch TV and film picked by a very strict nun? All right, so I'm going to put you in a couple of breakout rooms. Discuss this amongst yourself for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and report.
Hey, Todd, would this nun also have control over what type of video games you play? Is that like,
I think it's got to be all media. I think it's
okay.
got to be all media. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, yeah, no. Why am I forgetting the name of the game? Uh, when you steal cars. Boy, I'm really
Well,
super old, right?
no, no, yeah, no Grand Theft Auto or
Grand
Call of
Theft Auto. Thank you. Yes. All right. What was the conclusion? Who would prefer to eat like a 3-year-old? I'm honestly surprised that it's not all of you. And who would prefer to have their media monitored by a strict nun? Ben, I did not see that one coming, quite honestly. I did not see that one coming. I thought for sure you, of all people, would want to have your own media. How can you
Well,
explain this?
well, let's think about it. If I eat what a 3-year-old eats, I'm gonna die from malnourishment. I don't. I think this one's pretty obvious.
I I don't know. See, I seem to remember having this conversation last year in China, where I was talking about how my 6-year-old eats nothing but things that are white, and like talking to a few of you who all said, "Yeah, yeah, I only eat things that are white too," because basically a college male kind of eats like a 3-year-old, or at least a lot of them do.
Maybe I think we eat a lot more sodium.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Though I don't know. I think 3-year-olds,
But
maybe not 3-year-olds,
we
but as
also
they get older.
we also had a conversation about why people visiting another country were so hesitant to try local food,
Hmm.
right? And I think my hypothesis was that it's such a fundamental thing that you need to have managed, which is your nourishment, the thing that keeps you alive.
Right.
So I think that's why people are so hesitant to take risks about that.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. I just think it's really important.
Right. All right. What? Anybody else? Max, why did you'd rather eat like a 3-year-old guy, right? You
Um,
basically refute Ben here.
I think my understanding is that you could still like ask or like influence what the theory, like you could ask like, hey, can I eat so and so, and they would just say yes or no. So you would still have some input.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends if you would want to go out by eating too much ice cream or if you want to go out by killing yourself after having to watch too many Hallmark movies. Um, I mean, personally, I would rather go out eating ice cream. Like, I don't think I could have a nun monitoring my. I mean, I couldn't watch The Sopranos, man. I mean, why live? So, all right. Well, you guys continue to surprise me. Very good.
Well, did you pull the loophole card like with the nun? Like you didn't specify religion. Like if it's Catholic nun, obviously, you're not gonna like you said Hallmark, Sound of Music, Little House on the Prairie, that kind of stuff. But like, I mean, I'm sure there's some kind of looser religion that I mean.
But there's nuns that are not Catholic.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, all right. Maybe you got your own private religion going, Cole, which is just.
I mean, I could always just start my own, I guess, if it came down to it.
I think you're thinking too much of this sexy nun.
No, not like that, but like, what the heck? I can't remember who teaches it, but like one of the intro courses at Cornell my freshman year was like a religion introduction.
Hmm.
And they talked about how certain religions, especially with like Christianity, they're a little bit more looser when it comes to certain aspects of life.
Right. Well, there are also some very liberal Catholic nuns too, but this says very strict nuns. So.
Yeah, my grandmother's basically one, so I know exactly. That's why I was hoping for the loophole.
All right. Well, back to business. So we've kind of talked a little bit about financial crises broadly and some of the impacts of them. Talked a little bit about 2008 financial crisis. How do we get this all to fit into our macro model, right? How could we possibly fit this kind of stuff into our macro model, right? Well, I think there's really two ways that we could think about these effects. The first way is probably very obvious. We know that financial crises are associated with declines in wealth, and declines in wealth are probably most easily incorporated into our model as simply a decline in aggregate demand, right? A negative aggregate demand shock. Right? A negative aggregate demand shock. So that would be one way to incorporate many of these effects. But I think we have to think about something else. Sorry, brought my pen. We have to think about something else. One of the things that we observed was this big spike in interest rates, right? Despite the fact that the Fed was trying to reduce interest rates, we saw interest rates go through the roof. And that's not something that is possible in the short-run macro model that we've developed to this point, because we assume that the Federal Reserve completely controls interest rates. But what we saw in 2008 is that the Fed lowered the federal funds rate to 0, but yet other interest rates went up through the roof. And so we really need to think about how can we incorporate the fact that interest rates can spike, right? We need to think about how we can incorporate the fact that the Fed doesn't control interest rates during a crisis, that the Fed could be pushing interest rates down, and yet many interest rates would rise. And so here's the suggestion of your author, which I think this is a good one. Think about it this way. Let's assume that the real interest rate that we've been talking about really has two components. Our FF and then F bar. Our FF is the federal funds interest rate. This is controlled by the Fed or by the central bank. Well, what's F bar? This is an exogenous shock. We could think about this as a risk premium. That this risk premium can go up during periods of high risk. So in other words, when perceived risk in the financial system goes up, then F bar goes up. So during normal times, this risk premium is close to 0. But during the crisis, F bar is greater than 0. So the Fed can reduce the federal funds rate, but real interest rates can still go up if this risk premium goes up enough. Okay. So this is a small change to our model. I would consider this to be a small change to our model, but it actually adds another kind of shock. You know, here we have essentially a financial shock where the central bank can no longer control interest rates. So let's think about the 2008 crisis. Which really had two phenomena happen at the same time. First off, A bar went down because of the fall in wealth. And F bar goes up because of the financial crisis. And the increase in risk. So let's think through this in terms of our short run macro model. First, let's think about our ISMP curve. Okay, so here we are going along at full employment, at trend, and then we have these two shocks. First off, what impact does the fall in A bar have? That reduces the IS curve. But then the second effect is what happens when F bar goes up. This is going to increase that MP curve. Even if the Fed sets the real interest rate equal to, or the federal funds rate equal to 0. So in other words, the MP curve first shifts down as the central bank sets the interest rate to 0, but then it gets shifted way back up when you account for the fact that F bar has increased so much. So the difference here between these two is F bar. Okay. That F bar can raise the real interest rate from down to 0 to way up here. I don't know why. Readjust this. So in other words, even though the Fed tried to lower the MP curve, essentially the MP curve went up because of the increase in F. And so what do we get? We get a big fall in short run output from these two shocks. The problem here is that the central bank can only reduce the federal funds rate to 0. There's a limit to the power of the Federal Reserve, right? This is often known as the liquidity trap. That there's a limit to monetary policy. And that limit to monetary policy is you can't push interest rates really below 0, or at least in theory. In practice, you can, right? In practice, you can, though there's a real question of how much below 0 you can push it before people will just stop putting their money in the financial system. But this is essentially a limit, a floor to monetary policy. The federal funds rate can only go to 0. And so this definitely happened in 2008, where the Fed tried to lower interest rates, but in fact, very quickly hit the point where interest rates hit 0, and then there wasn't anything they could do, right? The risk premium continued to go up, interest rates went up, despite the efforts of the Fed to try to drive interest rates down. So this kind of explains why we got a much bigger fall in short run output than we would have expected if there was no financial crisis, right? If there's no financial crisis, we would have just had to worry about the impact of the fall in the IS curve. Now we also have to worry about the rise in the MP curve. And so it's that second shock that makes the fall in short run output so large. How about in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply? Okay. Well, let's talk about what aggregate demand and aggregate supply looks like now in our model. Remember yesterday we had this monetary policy rule. And we also have our new interest rate rule. So what happens if we plug 2 into 1 here? Then what can we do? We can rewrite this. How do I want to do this? Sorry, yeah, so we can rewrite this like this. If you plug this into the IS curve, then what do you get? We get an aggregate demand curve. Notice how this looks different than before. Not much different. It looks just pretty much like the aggregate demand curve we had before, but now there's a new kind of shock. Now we have a financial crisis shock here to our aggregate demand curve. So now an aggregate demand shock can come from a change in A or a change in F. There's two types of aggregate demand shocks that are now possible in this economy. So the aggregate demand curve really looks very much the same as we had yesterday. We just have this extra term in there, right? We just have this extra term in there. So now what happens in our model? Well, we have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And now what happens when we have this shock? We don't just have one shock, we have two shocks that reduce aggregate demand, right? And drive output way down. And so in period one, we have a fall in short run output and a fall in inflation. Is that the end of the story, though? No, because remember those dynamics. Those dynamics we talked about yesterday are still in this model. Right? So what's going to happen in future periods is aggregate supply is going to shift to the right over time. And this will move short run output back towards 0. And lower inflation even more. But that's not the end of the story either, because as we talked about yesterday, eventually the crisis will end. And aggregate demand will return to where it was. So what will happen here? Then aggregate demand will go up and output's gonna be positive. Inflation will start to shoot up. Then aggregate supply begins to shift to the left. We'll make this yellow here. Aggregate supply shifts to the left. And so now the aggregate supply curve starts to go back that way, and short run output goes back to 0. And inflation returns to its target. These are the counterclockwise movements in inflation and output again. Yesterday, we worked through a positive demand shock, but here today, we just worked through a negative demand shock. But it's the same deal. Really, the only difference here between what we talked about today and what we talked about yesterday is we're just going to get bigger shocks. And the reason we get bigger shocks is because we have now two sources of shocks, a change in A bar, but also a change in F bar. So two sources of shocks means bigger sources of shocks, right? So yeah, I think this is how we can very simply change our short run macro model to try to capture the fact that financial crises have even bigger consequences when it comes to recessions. One of the things here that we should note initially, a large decrease in aggregate demand leads to a decrease in inflation. In fact, it's possible that you can have deflation, where inflation actually becomes negative. And this happened in 2009. It happened during the Great Depression. and it happened in '08. Both of these periods of time, we had deflation, meaning the price level actually fell. We had negative inflation. And deflation is a problem. Deflation in and of itself can be a big problem. And let's think about why that is. The first off is it almost always means that you have rising real interest rates. So inflation goes down, real interest rates go up, right? And this can lead to defaults, where borrowers just simply say, I can't pay those high real interest rates, I default. It also leads to a rising real value of debt. So debt goes up in real terms. This also encourages people to default. So once again, the financial crisis feeds on itself. The financial crisis causes deflation. Deflation worsens the financial crisis, right? We once again have this negative feedback loop. And then it leads to the liquidity trap that we talked about. When inflation goes to zero, traditional monetary policy becomes ineffective. Because you hit this liquidity trap. Right? You hit this liquidity trap. And so deflation, strangely, might be worse than inflation because it begins to really worsen the financial crisis. So during, just the example, during the Great Depression, we had a fall in the price level of 25%. So that was a dramatic deflation, much worse than what we had in 2009. And one of the consequences of that deflation was in places like Iowa, 40% of farmers were in default in 1932, all right? So when 40% of farmers are in default, you know that your financial system is ruined, right? Because there's no way that banks can operate when 40% of their loans are being defaulted on, right? I mean, that is a collapse in the financial system that is going to have serious ramifications for aggregate demand. And so when you talk about this liquidity trap, we really see this. We see how the Fed got trapped by this in some ways. Where are we? So this is looking at the actual federal funds rate and then the Taylor rule prediction for what the federal funds rate should be. Do we remember what the Taylor rule is from yesterday afternoon? Let me go back here for a second. Remember that the Taylor rule is a monetary policy rule that says that what should interest rates be? What should the federal funds interest rate be? It should be based on inflation and in part on short run output. So there's two things that should determine what the Fed's interest rate target is. Where inflation is relative to its target and where short run output is relative to trend. So we can set R bar the 2% and the inflation target to 2%. And I think your book assumes that each of these are 1/2. M bar and N bar is equal to 1/2. Just like we did yesterday afternoon. just like we did yesterday afternoon. So now let's go back and look at this figure. The blue line is the federal funds rate that the Fed actually predicted. And then the Taylor rule is, what does the Taylor rule say the federal funds rate should have been? Notice here that the Taylor rule actually said the Fed should have tried to keep interest rates above zero. The Fed was much, much more aggressive than what the Taylor rule suggested. And here you see the liquidity trap, right? Notice here that very quickly, as the recession began to occur, the Fed took the actual federal funds rate and they took it all the way down to zero, right? Just as quickly as it possibly could. But then when it hits zero, there's really not much else the Fed could do in terms of interest rates, right? This graph is also interesting because many economists have pointed to this graph and said, this is a mistake. There is a mistake that the Fed made here. And the mistake is not what they did during the 2008 financial crisis. It's what they did in the years before the 2008 financial crisis. That notice here in the years before the 2008 financial crisis, in general, the actual federal funds rate was below the Taylor rule, meaning that the Fed was too easy. The Fed kept interest rates too low. And so many economists have criticized the Fed that the Fed should have had interest rates higher during the boom. The Fed should have been doing more to kind of, tamp down the boom and try to reduce lending by keeping interest rates high. Instead, the Fed tended to keep interest rates pretty low. And so, I think a lot of critics of the Fed don't really blame the Fed for what they did during the recession, but more in what they failed to do in the lead up to the recession. How did the Fed drive interest rates down to zero? Well, here we have different measures of M1 and M2 in currency, but you can see in all of these cases, the Fed pretty dramatically tried to increase money supply, right? So the Fed dramatically increased the money supply. However, this didn't lead to much inflation. Why? Because aggregate demand was falling, right? Once again, the Fed was increasing the money supply and cutting interest rates, trying to stimulate aggregate demand. But the fact of the matter is that you can cut interest rates as low as you want, and you can print up as much money as you want. If people are scared, they're just not going to spend. And so that's why we haven't had any inflation, is because aggregate demand remained low, right? And then here, after the recession was over, you can see that the Fed backed off, right? The Fed stopped printing up so much money, just as they're supposed to do. And so while many people looked during the crisis, I can remember many people saying, oh, we're going to have inflation, hyperinflation, blah, 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 blah. In fact, we had none of that, right? Inflation remained low, and it has stayed low after the crisis, even though money growth has been pretty high. And, that just reflects, the fact that the financial system has changed fundamentally in terms of how money relates to inflation. As people use money in different ways, as we move to electronic money, the relationship between the money supply and inflation is much less closely related than it used to be. And so, the Fed is kind of figuring all this stuff out as they go along, right? And always, kind of adjusting the money supply based on current conditions. So, despite what its critics worried about, we have not seen a lot of inflation. But in part, that just reflects the reality that the Fed, they can do some things. The Fed can still keep inflation under control, but during a crisis, their ability to try to stimulate output is limited. What exactly did the Fed do during the crisis? Well, I want to talk about that, right? Because while the Fed lowered interest rates to zero, that doesn't mean that was the only thing that they did, right? That doesn't mean that was the only thing they did. But to get into that, maybe we want to try to save that for this afternoon. Let's save it for this afternoon, right? Now, this afternoon's class, I have a faculty meeting that lasts from 12 to 1 o'clock. So we are not going to start afternoon class till 1 o'clock, okay? So we will have afternoon class starting at 1 o'clock, and we'll try to keep it, relatively short. We'll try to finish up by 2. So I'll kind of go through my notes and edit them down and we'll try to keep it to an hour. All right. So we'll have class this afternoon from 1 o'clock to 2. Don't show up at 12:30. And we will kind of finish up our material here on financial crises, specifically talking about stabilization policy. And then we will also, if you have any questions about homework number 4, this afternoon would be a good time to bring them. Okay? Okay. All right. Thank you for everything, everyone. Take care. Have a good lunch.
You got my message, right?
Your message about that you got the note?
No. Oh, yeah, that one too. No. Showed up again to fix something. So I messaged you while I was turning off my camera.
Oh, about the code?
But yeah, I put it in the chat on the.
Oh, I thought that was your old message. No, you're good.
Oh,
you're good.
Yeah, had to fix something. It just showed up randomly. But I had a quick question about the homework. So on question 2 for chapter 12, when you were saying, the O shock, so the exogenous shock factor to supply, becomes positive. You were saying that's just saying that the O bar increase is greater than 0, right? So it's actually going to be a negative shock.
Exactly.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that was clear because that's what I based my whole answer off of. And then what was I? Oh, for question number 1 for the ISMP and then the ADAS graph for our model to illustrate our explanation of the analysis that you asked us for. Is there a specific ADAS graph that you were wanting us to do? Because I know we have a couple.
Well, no, I mean, you want to use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right? So use the model and provide a graph of what happens in that model.
Okay, that makes more sense. Sorry, it said ISMP and then ASAD graphs. So I was like, shit, well, I know about 3 of them. So I just wanted to make sure it wasn't which one specific. All right, that was all I needed to ask. So I'm good. Thank you.
All right.